Hi, everyone. So I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes. And if you have any questions, please ask me at the end. Just to introduce myself first and give you a bit of context, my name is Héctor, and I'm primarily a media artist, and I work a lot with video and with machine learning. So I'm really interested in how computational models can function as a medium for art making. I'm also a theoretician, and this talk is not going to be a very practical talk. It's more of a kind of conceptual, philosophical discussion. And the last thing I wanted to mention by way of introduction is that I live in Hong Kong, and I teach in a school of media art, and I was the founder of the first art and science undergraduate major in Hong Kong. So I'm really interested in how we can relate art to science. And this is also one of the topics of the talk. So without further ado, let me start. So the first idea is to think about interactive narratives that are in some sense simulationist, right? So those where the main activity of the author is the creation of a model, very broadly speaking. Yeah. And I don't mean to introduce this as a category which is binary, where a work is either simulationist or not, but just to say, well, works can be more or less simulationist to the extent that the author's interest lies in the design of a model or a simulation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it from the perspective of art and science, and maybe give a bit of a historical discussion about what simulationist narrative means. Yeah, I want to start by situating it historically in terms of the history of modern science. And in particular, there was the development roughly in the 19th century of something that a philosopher, Mauricio Suárez, called the modeling attitude. This is an attitude according to which the main task of science is the construction of models. So you had physicists like Hertz or Boltzmann, who were practicing scientists, but who were in a sense also philosophers, and who reflected on their practice. And they came to believe that we can only know the world by making models of the world. We can only know what we model. And this is I think, a fundamental shift in how we think about science. One philosopher, Giambattista Vico, also, even beyond natural science, argued that we can only know what we have made. So he called this the verum factum principle. So this is the idea that unless we make something, we can't know it. Vico was kind of opposed to the philosophy of René Descartes. Descartes very famously believed that we can only know for certain the content of our consciousness because it's direct. We cannot know the external world because we can only know it indirectly through our senses. Only our consciousness, our mind, can be known with certainty. Vico disagreed. He said we can't know our consciousness very well because we haven't made it. We can only know what we have made. So this is the idea of the modeling attitude. And within this tradition, there was a whole line of thought, starting maybe in Germany, around the idea of models. And this idea influenced philosophers like Wittgenstein or a mathematician, Frederick Weissman, who emphasized the role of making models, and especially the principle of the autonomy of models. One of the ideas that they came up with, or that they put forward, is the idea that we can take a model as an object in its own right. And models are valuable even if they're not necessarily true, or even accurate, or even true enough. A model might be completely false in many ways, but it can still be interesting because we can use the model to compare it with reality and see how maybe reality is different from the model. We can even study the model as something in its own right. So the construction of models becomes something, not just a vehicle to know the world, not just a vehicle to develop theories, but models become ends in themselves. And one of the points I want to make here is that we as artists can think of the creation of models as like speculative objects that we create in order to explore different ways of thinking. Yeah. So Weismann, for example, said non-Euclidean geometry would be interesting even if it had no application in natural science, just because it gives us another way of thinking about the world. So that's the idea of the autonomy of models. Now, I want to develop this idea with reference to the work of a philosopher, Max Black, who compared models with metaphors. He said, by thinking about metaphors, we can understand how models work. And basically, Black wanted to oppose any concept of metaphor that emphasizes resemblance or similarity. Take, for example, the metaphor, human beings are wolves. One viewpoint, one theory of metaphor would say that when I say human beings are wolves, I'm expressing a resemblance. Human beings resemble wolves, for example, because human beings are cruel, they are predators, whatever. But there's a resemblance that is being expressed in the metaphor. Another way to think about metaphor is to say that when I say human beings are wolves, what I mean is human beings are cruel and predatory. So somehow the metaphor itself, according to these theories, becomes something dispensable, something that we can just throw out the window. We can replace the metaphor with a literal statement. Yeah. I don't have to say human beings are wolves. I can just say human beings are cruel or predatory. And what Max Planck says is this way of thinking about metaphor is misleading. Instead, he proposed what he called an interactive view of metaphor. And what he means is metaphors are indispensable to human knowledge. There are certain things that we can only say by means of metaphors. So, for example, when I say persons are wolves, I'm using wolves as a kind of lens around which to organize my perspective on human beings. And the way I do it is by taking certain commonplaces that I associate with wolves. Not so much the definition of a wolf, but certain common sense principles that I attach to wolves. For example, that wolves are cruel, that they are predators, that they are harmful. And I look at human beings from that perspective. But what he says is, I'm not just expressing a similarity. I'm reorganizing my whole perspective on human beings, my whole understanding of human beings. And I'm also changing how I look at wolves. I look at them as more human-like than I normally would. So it's not that I find a resemblance that I already understand, and I use that resemblance to create a metaphor. The metaphor creates the resemblance, and in so doing, it changes the meanings of the terms that occur in it. Black also points out to some metaphors that are creative, where we're not even using commonplaces associated with a word, where the metaphor generates its own meaning. For example, Wallace Stevens, who said the garden was a slum of bloom. Yeah, there's no prior resemblance that we're expressing through the metaphor. If anything, the metaphor creates the resemblance. And this is a very distinctive intellectual operation that is not just about making comparisons, but it's about generating the terms of the comparison, and so changing the terms that occur in the metaphor. So according to Max Planck, when we make models of things, we're doing something similar to metaphors. We are taking two domains and we are relating them to one another. But in so doing, we're changing our understanding of those domains. So, for example, if we say that a video sequence is like a graph, where every node is an image in the sequence. We are looking at video through the lens of graph theory, right? The main difference here is that we're not simply using the commonplaces associated with movies. We are imposing a highly organized, technically sophisticated vocabulary. And this gives us new things we can do with a video sequence. If we think of a video sequence as a mathematical graph, we can then, for example, compute the Laplacian matrix of the graph. We can perform operations in linear algebra. For example, we can compute a singular value decomposition on the matrix, right? So there are new things we can do through the act of modeling. And in that sense, it's like a metaphor because it's really changing the meaning of the terms that occur in it. There's an interaction between the domains. And in a way, what a model does, like a metaphor, is it builds a discourse. And in that sense, the creation of a model is like the representation of something in art, right? Like when we make a picture of something, we make a painting of something, the features of our medium, whatever medium we're using, let's say painting, inflect our understanding of the content being represented in that medium. So in a way, when we are able to portray something in a painting, that changes how we think about that something. It reorganizes our understanding of that something. It's not simply that we can give information about faces, but we change how we think about faces in the painting. And in a sense, models are the same. They inflect our understanding of the content, whatever. They change our understanding of whatever we can represent in the model. Yeah. So I think when we're dealing with interactive fictions, especially those that are highly simulationist in nature, we are constructing models of narrative, and we're also constructing models of agency. And that construction changes how we understand both narrative and agency. We change how we understand those things by making models of them. But when I say that interactive fiction creates models of narrative and of agency, I don't mean that there are two different kinds of models being created in every work of interactive fiction. I mean that by creating a model of narrative, the author also creates a model of agency. They're interconnected. So I speak of models of agential narrative being created. And I would suggest that one major area of research for authors of interactive fiction is the creation of different models of agency and different models of narrative, different ways of thinking about narrative and agency, and how agency and narrative relate together. One of the points I will make later is that whenever we think seriously about narrative, we think about agency. And I will explain a little bit more about it later. So I want to start with the question of models of agency, because we often take agency for granted as something like we know what agency means. But actually, within even just thinking of Western culture, if we forget about, say, Chinese culture, for example, that I'm a little bit familiar with as well, there are many different models of agency. Yeah. And in the full version of the paper, I have a long discussion about how we think about agency. And I'm not going to go through everything here since the paper is online, but just to say that agency is not a single homogeneous concept. And by making models of agency, we can expand how we think about agency. So to go back to the idea of making models, suppose that someone says, whenever we speak, we must always include the first person. You might say to that person, maybe not. What if we invent a model of language, a small-scale language, where the first person is completely absent? So we can't ever say, I am so-and-so, or I feel cold, or anything like that. What would such a language look like? By creating a model, we can speculatively design another way of thinking about language. one where the first person is absent. And in the same way, when we create models of narrative and agency, we are exploring new ways of thinking about narrative and agency. Now, one thing I want to say about agency in Western culture is that traditionally we often think about agency in terms of planning. That is, that agency involves constructing a plan. I'm an agent insofar as I can plan. And we tend to think of plans as something that we construct before action. So I first plan and then I act. So the plan is a sequence of operations to be performed by an organism who also keeps track of the environment. So the essence of goal-seeking responsive behavior is in planning. And this is the idea of agency that many people have. Right? So the plan comes before action. But this is not the only way we can think of agency. So an alternative to this idea that the plan is like a program that determines action in advance is the idea of the plan as communication or plan as participation, where the plan is just a resource that I use, but it doesn't determine what I do. I have to improvise what I do. Some versions of this idea argue that plans are not things that we come up with before acting, but we plan as we act. This is the online planning paradigm, where the idea is the plan and the execution are not separate. The plan can come in before the execution being just mechanical, but the plan and the execution being integrated together, right? So the plan is not separate from the execution. And this online planning idea, I think, is important because I would suggest that interactive fiction and interactive art in general instantiates a concept of action or agency as online planning. I will come back to this later. The plan is not something that happens before the action and mechanically determines it. Yeah, I'm going to skip this. So, and again, I'm summarizing the paper. One of the distinctive features of interactive fiction as an art form is the idea of the black box. And I want to spend a bit of time on this idea because I think in creating black boxes, we also create models of agency. So the idea of the black box is a concept that also grew out of the modeling culture, and particularly the cybernetic movement in the 40s and 50s. So the idea is the world is a black box. Any system that we study is a black box. We don't know how it works. We can only interact with it by producing changes and then observing its behavior. And one philosopher, Andrew Pickering, argued that the concept of the black box highlights performance over knowledge, that according to the idea of the black box, our engagement with the world is primarily performative, that what matters is what you do, and the world becomes a partner in what he calls a dance of agency. So knowledge is an improvisational practice. So from this point of view, what matters is not whatever theory we come up with. It's not the result of knowledge, but the practical performative engagement when we are working with black boxes. Now, what's special about interactive art is that the artist creates a synthetic black box. In other words, you create a black box to design something as a black box, where you intend the black box to be interacted with by someone who doesn't know its internal mechanism. So it's very distinctive about computational art. Interactive art is a much broader idea. It does not have to involve a black box in the same sense, right? You can give, for example, the audience a white piece of paper and some crayons and ask them to draw on them and call that an interactive artwork. But it's not really a black box that you design for the audience. There's no sense of hiddenness. So when we create a synthetic black box, the aesthetics of it are about how the player attempts to understand how inputs correlate with outputs, how the behavior of the black box functionally depends on the interactions with the player. So this becomes how the designer of an interactive fiction creates a model of agency within the black box. And I would suggest that this concept of agency is one that has to do with online planning, that the player or the interactor with the black box is meant to plan interactively, not to form a plan in advance, but to develop a plan while interacting with the black box. So there is a kind of philosophical implication built into the design of these systems. I will say a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but I now want to turn to the question of narrative. And the first thing I want to say is that to think deeply about narrative is to think of narrative as involving agency. We can see this point by looking at narrative as a kind of making. Narrative is something that someone made. And to look at it as making involves three aspects. First, because narrative is something made, it necessarily involves agency. So it makes sense to think about how narrative involves agency. More specifically, every narrative is rhetorical. So there is a narrator or an author, if you like, or a surrogate of the author who crafts the narrative to, in some sense, influence, even manipulate a reader or player or viewer. So the rhetorical function of narrative means that the agency of the author and the agency of the recipient are modeled in the narrative. That in a sense, every narrative text models the agency of the recipient in relation to the agency of the narrator. So already the idea of agency is built into narrative as such. So I had a long discussion of this, which is in my paper. And I'm almost done in terms of narrative and closure. So I'm going to skip this. I have a discussion of riddles and of the nature of riddles and how we can look at all narrative in a way as a riddle. Yeah, but I'm going to skip that section. It's quite a long section in the paper. So the point I want to say is that any playable interactive artifact models the agency of the player as a participatory improvisational kind of action. So it calls upon us to engage with agency improvisationally. Yeah. And that means that in a way, by modeling agency in that way, the models we create inflect our understanding of agency as improvisational, as not pre-planned, not planning in that sense of a preconceived notion, right? But as essentially improvisational and participatory. Yeah. So in that sense, and maybe I can come to an end, this is a kind of quick summary, that interactive fiction constructs models as speculative instruments that allow us to explore, to implement, reflect on various models of agential narrative, including models that play with or reject the planning paradigm. So what matters here is to take on an attitude of avoiding dogmatism about models. Models don't have to be true or false. We need not reject a model to find it interesting, but rather we take exploring the model as a poetic activity and as the core of the artistic action. This was very, very fast, and I skipped some discussions, but let me say thank you. And here is my email. If you'd like a full version of the paper where I go into narrative as riddles and go deeper into the idea of narrative as agency, you're welcome to write me. There is a version of the paper online. I'm not sure whether it's the most updated version. I've sent one version to the organizers, but I'm not sure whether it's really updated. But you're very welcome to write me if you would like a full version of the paper. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hector. I appreciate that. Can you see me and hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. So we're going to slide into the Q&A now.
Okay.
I wanted to encourage you after the talk is over to share your slides to the Discord because they weren't sliding too easily, and people would love to read them if they get a chance. So,
All right.
that said, I'm going to start with a question from the room. So,
Right.
does anyone have any questions for Mr. Rodríguez? Nope. Okay, let me check Discord. Give me just 1 minute, sir.
Sure. See.
So, someone wants to know, when you use the term metaphor, are you referring to it in a literary sense or in a literal sense?
Yeah, it's a good question because in this paper, I don't spend a lot of time defining a lot of my terms. So I can see that there could be some doubts about what it means. So I'm using the term metaphor simply to indicate that there is you might say, a vehicle and a topic. That in the case of people are wolves, the topic would be people, and the vehicle would be wolves, whether in literature or in everyday language, where we use the vehicle as a lens through which to view the topic. And this is a bit loose because the term itself is a difficult term to define. And part of the point is what is involved in metaphors. So the idea that I was trying to put forward is that when we do this, we're not just finding something that we already understood, some way in which the vehicle and the topic are already similar, but that in creating the metaphor, we change how we think about the vehicle and the topic. And that's really the key. And I wanted to somehow say that when we create models, we also change how we think about both the model and the thing being modeled, that they interact with each other. There's a kind of looping effect or feedback effect from one to the other. I don't know if that makes sense.
It made sense to me, for whatever it's worth. Anybody, I don't know if anybody has any questions to jump in on. No? Okay. There is only one other question in Discord, and I guess we'll wrap it up at that point unless someone has something else to add.
Okay.
The last question has to do with, they were asking where you found your inspiration for the topic and what brought you to decide to write a paper literally about this specific topic rather than anything else.
I think I kind of hear something about behind the question. I almost want to ask why you're asking the question. Like, but okay. The immediate inspiration was a course that I taught on interactive fiction. And the course was taught here in Hong Kong to students in an art and science major. Most of the students are media artists. So we used Inform 7 and Twine in teaching the course. But I was interested in helping those students from that background who are interested in thinking through the connection between art and science, to think about how this practice can maybe do something towards connecting those two disciplines or those two kinds of disciplines and build a kind of third culture, so to speak.
For whatever it's worth, no subtext, just curious.
Sorry. See. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Last opportunity, if anybody has any questions in person, say so now, or forever hold your peace. No?
I have one comment. We will get the most updated version of the paper up on the website. We just did not get to do it this week with everything else that's going on. But
Okay.
the one you sent me will go up.
Okay. I will.
Also, I'm Steve. I would communicate the email.
Thank you. The paper is quite a long paper. It's quite a long paper, and there's a lot of details. So I only gave the skeleton of it. But thank you for that. And you're all very welcome to contact me at my email if you wish more updated version.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Rodriguez.
Just call me Héctor.
Afterwards, if you'd be kind enough to pop into the Discord, if anybody has any follow-up questions, we would really appreciate it. Other than that, thank you again for coming, and we hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.